October 2020, the San Joaquin Valley, California. The first thing you felt, stepping out of the rusted cab of the truck onto County Road 9, wasn't the suffocating triple-digit heat. It was the crunch, the agonizing, brittle shatter of topsoil that had turned to literal dust under the heavy soles of your work boots. The wind blowing across the valley floor didn't smell like earth anymore. It smelled like hot metal, baking alkali, and the faint, acrid scent of dead wood. For miles in every direction, the skeletons of once lush almond orchards stood frozen in the haze. The trunks were painted white with kaolin clay, a desperate, failing attempt by corporate farm managers to reflect the relentless sun away from the dying bark. The massive diesel-powered turbine pumps that used to hum day and night, violently drawing thousands of gallons of water from the deep subterranean aquifer, were dead silent. The state had finally shut the valves. The aquitard was collapsing. The official agricultural water allotments had hit zero. And right there, amid this gray, sprawling cemetery of dead trees and fractured earth, a single impossible flash of color caught the harsh, dry wind. A fragile violet petal, a crocus sativus, saffron, blooming directly out of the cracked, unwatered, seemingly dead dirt. Clara Vance dropped to her knees in the dust. Her cracked, calloused fingers, stained with earth and engine grease, delicately brushed the abrasive soil away from the base of the tiny purple flower. She exhaled, her breath kicking up a tiny cloud of dry silt, and pulled a heavy, folded piece of paper from her flannel pocket. The paper was crisp, bearing the official embossed seal of the Kings County tax assessor. It wasn't a map, and it wasn't a farming permit. It was a notice of default. $142,850. That was the exact inescapable number printed in bold black ink. It was the lien placed on her family's 80-acre plot due to 3 consecutive years of catastrophic crop failure and unpaid agricultural property taxes. She had exactly 14 months before the regional bank brought down the gavel and auctioned off the dirt her grandfather had bled for to a corporate holding company. 14 months, 0 state irrigation water, a dead well, and a checking account holding exactly $1,402. Most people in the valley believed Clara Vance was having a slow, highly public nervous breakdown. 6 months earlier, while the corporate mega-farms surrounding her property were spending tens of millions of dollars drilling deeper, illegal wells to chase the vanishing water table into the bedrock, Clara did the unthinkable. She hired an independent logging crew to rip out 60 acres of her family's heritage almond trees. Martin Rourke, a third-generation commodity grower whose massive, industrially managed orchards bordered hers to the north, had parked his heavy-duty F-150 by her fence line the morning the chainsaws were running. The air was thick with sawdust and the deafening roar of 2-stroke engines. Martin had rolled down his tinted window, the air conditioning blasting from his cab, and leaned his arm on the door. He was chewing on a mouthful of salted sunflower seeds, spitting the shells into a plastic cup on his dashboard. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at her barren, freshly bulldozed dirt. "You're committing financial suicide, Clara," he had scoffed, having to shout over the mechanical scream of the wood chippers. "You can't farm this valley without deep pumping. You're trying to run a boutique hobby garden in a literal desert? The bank's going to eat you alive by Christmas, and I'll be the one buying this lot for pennies on the dollar." But Martin didn't understand the brutal math of survival. Clara wasn't playing the volume game anymore. The corporate Goliath next door was trying to force a thirsty, water-heavy crop out of a dying ecosystem using brute financial force, synthetic fertilizers, and industrial plumbing. Clara was doing the exact opposite. She was chasing the highest conceivable financial value from the absolute smallest drop of ambient moisture. She wasn't trying to beat the desert, she was learning to mimic it. Before we dive into the precise biological engineering that allowed Clara to turn a bone-dry patch of California dirt into a sanctuary for the most expensive agricultural commodity on planet Earth, while her well-funded neighbors went bankrupt, take a second to hit that like button. If you believe in working with the devastating forces of nature rather than fighting them to the death, and if you respect the quiet resilience of small-scale innovation, subscribe to the channel. We've got a long, dry, and fascinating road ahead. Clara wasn't just trying to save a piece of real estate from foreclosure. When her grandfather arrived in the San Joaquin Valley in the late 1960s, he brought almost nothing with him except a heavy, hand-forged brass soil thermometer from the old country. It was heavily tarnished, the glass scratched from decades of use, and it was the only thing of real value he owned. He used to take Clara out into the fields before dawn, plunge the brass spike into the cool earth, and tell her in a hushed voice, "You don't water the tree, Mija. You water the shadows. You feed the life you cannot see." For years, under the crushing pressure of modern agricultural mandates, the Vance farm had abandoned that ancient wisdom. They had installed miles of black plastic drip lines, aggressively applied synthetic nitrogen, and chased massive subsidized yields until the soil's natural microbiome was completely annihilated, turning the rich earth into lifeless sand. Clara wasn't just trying to pay off a $142,850 tax bill. She was trying to resurrect her grandfather's philosophy. She was holding that brass thermometer in her hand, trying to prove that the earth wasn't broken. The industrial system was. Instead of fighting the historic drought, Clara leaned entirely into it. Saffron crocus corms are evolutionary marvels native to the brutal, arid climates of the Mediterranean, Iran, and the Middle East. They are geophytes. They completely shut down and sleep during the scorching summer months, requiring absolutely zero water while the sun bakes the earth above them. They only wake up when the autumn temperatures drop and the barometric pressure shifts. But planting raw corms into depleted, heavily compacted California dust wasn't enough. The soil on the Vance farm had been stripped of its organic matter. If Clara just buried the corms, they would desiccate and die. She had to rebuild the microscopic architecture of the earth from the ground up, and she had no heavy machinery left to do it. This is where the excruciating physical toll of her rebellion began. While the corporate farms next door sprayed highly concentrated synthetic fertilizers from the air-conditioned cabs of GPS-guided tractors, Clara spent 12 to 14 hours a day on her hands and knees in the dirt. She was inoculating the soil with a highly specific biological agent, arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. She didn't use tillers or plows. She dragged a heavy steel hoe through the dirt, digging thousands of micro-trenches entirely by hand across the sloping topography of her land. Into these shallow trenches, she layered specialized compost mixed with agricultural biochar, a porous, carbon-rich charcoal. She painstakingly pressed the mycorrhizal fungal spores directly into the root zones of the sleeping saffron corms. This wasn't magic. It was highly advanced soil biology. The biochar acted as a microscopic sponge, holding on to whatever faint, ambient humidity existed in the morning air. The fungal spores, once activated, essentially grafted themselves onto the root systems of the saffron. In exchange for the carbon the plant produced, the fungus grew into a massive, invisible underground web, secreting a biological glue called glomalin that binds soil particles together. This web scavenged microscopic water molecules and traced minerals from deep within the dense clay, water that traditional plant roots could never reach. Thrust the heavy trowel, drop the small brown corm, sprinkle the dark fungal spores, pack the dirt tight, move exactly 2 inches to the right. Repeat. By the 3rd week of September, the knees of her denim work pants were soaked in blood and sweat. Her lower back locked into agonizing breathless spasms by 4 o'clock every single afternoon. The heavy brass soil thermometer hung from a frayed leather strap around her neck, tapping rhythmically against her chest like a relentless metronome. Thrust, drop, sprinkle, pack. She did this repetitive bone-grinding motion 45,000 times. By late November, the miracle she had engineered began to materialize. The first sharp, green, grass-like shoots had broken the hard surface of the earth. The Mycorrhizal network was actively working beneath the soil. The terrace structure she had built created a capillary action, pulling the faint morning dew down into the root zone before the harsh sun could evaporate it. Clara was actually doing it. She was growing life in a graveyard. Then the Pacific climate system delivered a cruel, paradoxical blow. After 8 consecutive months of zero precipitation, a massive atmospheric river stalled directly over the San Joaquin Valley. The barometric pressure plummeted. The air smelled sharply of ozone and wet dust. It didn't just rain, the sky violently ruptured. 5 inches of water fell in 3 devastating hours. For the corporate farms with their heavily compacted, dead, tractor-flattened soil, the rainwater had nowhere to go. It simply flashed off the surface, creating massive, toxic mudslides that carried away the topsoil and agricultural chemicals into the drainage ditches. For Clara, sitting on terraced land, it was a localized apocalypse. Because her slopes were freshly dug and structurally vulnerable, the sheer crushing velocity of the floodwaters overwhelmed the biochar trenches. Standing at the window of her darkened farmhouse at 2 in the morning, the valley illuminated by violent flashes of lightning, Clara watched a tidal wave of brown sludge rip through the entire eastern quadrant of her farm. The sound was horrifying, a deep, rushing, guttural roar of tearing earth and snapping roots. It sounded like the land itself was being ripped off its foundation. When dawn broke, the silence was suffocating. Clara pushed open her screen door and walked out into the cold, ankle-deep mud. The entire eastern terrace, representing a third of her carefully planted corms, a third of her potential revenue, and all of her safety margin against the bank lien, was completely gone. Washed down into a deep ravine at the edge of the property line. She dropped to her knees in the freezing gray sludge. She pulled the brass soil thermometer from her collar. The glass was caked in thick, lifeless clay. The $150 tax bill suddenly felt like a physical, crushing weight sitting directly on her ribcage. She had engineered the perfect drought survival system, but she hadn't accounted for the chaotic whiplash of a broken, unpredictable climate. She sat in the mud for 2 agonizing hours, the cold seeping deep into her bones, mentally drafting the phone call to the bank to surrender the deed. But as the morning sun crested the Sierra Nevada mountains and hit the devastated mudscape, Clara noticed something bizarre. She crawled toward the edge of the washout, where the violent water had stripped away the topsoil, exposing the deep sublayer of the western terrace. Something was holding the earth together. Millions of white, microscopic, web-like threads were clinging fiercely to the remaining soil. The mycorrhizal fungi. The flood had devastated the fragile surface, but the underground fungal network, heavily reinforced by the glomalin it produced, had acted like a biological rebar. It had literally woven the soil together. Over at Martin Rourke's industrial farm, the traditional almond trees, their shallow, water-pampered root systems entirely exposed, had simply surrendered. Dozens of massive trees had completely toppled over into the mud. But Clara's surviving saffron corms, locked into the earth by the fungal web, were still securely anchored. They had survived the deluge. Suddenly, time compressed. It was early December. The saffron bloom only lasts for exactly 3 weeks. The ticking clock hanging over the farm became deafening. If the blossoms opened and weren't harvested before the mid-morning sun hit them and wilted the petals, the volatile chemical compounds that give saffron its immense culinary and medicinal value. The crocin, the safranal, and the picrocrocin would rapidly degrade. This harvest could not be mechanized. No machine on earth is delicate enough to harvest saffron. Every single flower had to be carefully picked by hand in the freezing dark before dawn, and the 3 microscopic red stigmas inside each flower had to be tweezered out. For 21 consecutive days, Clara didn't sleep for more than 3 hours a night. She moved through the muddy fields like a ghost, a high-powered LED headlamp strapped to her forehead. Pinch the stem, snap the flower, drop it in the wicker basket. Her fingers became stained a deep, permanent, glowing yellow from the rich crocin oil. The ambient temperature dropped to near freezing. The wind howled off the snow-capped Sierras, biting fiercely through her canvas jacket. But the flowers kept aggressively opening. The deep fungal root system, supercharged by the floodwaters it had managed to absorb and retain, produced an absolute explosion of violet blooms. Snap, drop. Step, snap, drop, step. The rhythm was relentless, driven by sheer adrenaline and the looming threat of the bank. Every single ounce of dried, high-grade saffron was worth roughly $5,000 on the global spice market. She needed 30 pounds of dried product just to clear the debt. That meant extracting by hand over 2 million individual red stigmas. Realizing the physical impossibility of finishing alone, she recruited 3 neighboring families, small-scale generational farmers who had already lost their own land to the severe water cuts. She offered them a premium percentage of the final wholesale cut. They worked shoulder to shoulder under the harsh glare of portable floodlights. Snap, drop, tweeze, dry. The sheer repetitive mechanical volume of the human labor was a frantic, breathless race against the rising sun each morning. The farmhouse kitchen was converted into a massive drying room, the air thick and intoxicating with the heavy honey hay aroma of pure saffronol. In late January, an independent agricultural appraiser from a high-end San Francisco culinary syndicate arrived at Clara's scratched wooden kitchen table. He brought a portable chemical spectrometer in a hard black case. He didn't care about the story. He only cared about the data. Industrial, mass-produced saffron usually registers a crocin color level of around 190. Because Clara's crop was entirely dry-farmed, forced to struggle immensely in high-mineral, unpampered soil, and heavily inoculated with fungi, the biological stress had dramatically concentrated the plant's essential defense oils. The appraiser placed a small sample into the machine. The room was dead silent, except for the hum of the spectrometer. He stared at the digital reading. 285. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. It was some of the highest-grade, most chemically potent culinary saffron ever recorded in North American history. She didn't just clear the $142,850 lien. She doubled it in a single 3-week harvest. 3 days after the regional bank formally cleared the deed to the property, the heavy rumble of a diesel engine echoed up the driveway. Martin Rourke's F-150 pulled up to Clara's fence line. He stepped out of the cab. He didn't have a sunflower seed in his mouth this time. The arrogance was completely gone. He looked 10 years older, his face deeply hollowed out by the crushing stress of fighting a water war he was mathematically destined to lose. He looked out over the vast gray graveyard of his dead almond trees, and then he looked at Clara's meticulously terraced, biologically alive living soil. He walked slowly up to the fence line, taking his cap off and gripping it tightly in his thick, weathered hands. "I'm out of water, Clara," he said, his voice completely broken, barely hovering above a dry whisper. "The state cut the last deep aquifer permit yesterday. The pumps are locked out. I've got 1,000 acres of dead wood. I'm ruined." He paused, looking down at the dirt, swallowing hard. "How much to buy your system?" I'll lease your biological methodology. Name your absolute price. I've still got a line of credit. We can scale this across the whole county. We can make millions. Clara reached into the front pocket of her flannel shirt and pulled out the heavy, tarnished brass soil thermometer. She ran her permanently yellow-stained thumb over the scratched glass, feeling the weight of her grandfather's history in her palm. "It's not for sale, Martin," she said softly. His face fell into total, unrecoverable despair. "Because it's free," she finished, slipping the thermometer back into her pocket. Clara firmly refused the venture capital offers that inevitably followed. She refused to scale up into a corporate monolith, understanding that the pursuit of endless volume was exactly what destroyed the valley in the first place. Intentional scaling meant she kept her original 80 acres, paid her neighboring seasonal workers a thriving, life-changing wage, and maintained her own physical and mental sanity. Instead of patenting her unique terracing architecture and AMF inoculation methods, she completely open-sourced them. She printed thick physical manuals out of her own pocket and held free, hands-on workshops in her barn every weekend for any local farmer willing to rip out their water-addicted, failing crops and learn to farm the shadows. She wasn't building a financial monopoly. She was building a localized, drought-proof, biological rebellion. The small purple petal of the crocus had proven something profound to everyone in the San Joaquin Valley. Survival in a changing climate doesn't belong to the biggest machine, the deepest well, or the deepest pockets. It belongs to those willing to kneel quietly in the dirt, observe the microclimate, respect the unseen biology of the earth, and coax the highest possible value out of the harshest possible conditions. If Clara's story proves that the true future of survival lies in shared community knowledge rather than guarded corporate monopolies, then join this community. Hit subscribe, share this video with someone who needs a powerful reminder that small intentional acts of resilience can topple massive, failing systems, and let us know down in the comments. If the water ran dry tomorrow, what would you plant in the desert? Until next time, keep tending your soil.